Welcome. Today, we delve into the destructive Hive fleet Kraken and its impact on the Imperium's war with the Tyrannids. Hive fleet Kraken was the second major Tyrannid Hive fleet to invade the galaxy. It was responsible for the outbreak of the Second Tyrannic War, which began officially in the year 992 of the 41st millennium, with the loss of thousands of Imperial worlds to the Great Devourer. The Second Tyrannic War ended only after the Ultramarines chapter of Space Marines successfully broke the back of the Tyrannid invasion in Imperial space at the Battle of Ikar IV, and the craft world Aldari of Iyanden successfully defended their home at great cost against the Tyrannid horde. However, the Kraken was a massive Hive fleet from which multiple splinter fleets broke off to continue to threaten the Imperium to the present day. History. The invasion began 250 Terran years after the First Tyrannic War and the destruction of Hive fleet Behemoth by the Ultramarines and the Imperial Navy at the Battle of Macragge in the year 745 of the 41st millennium. An armed presence had been maintained in the galactic southeast, which officials of the Imperium's Adeptus Administratum began to question the need for, arguing that Behemoth had been the sum total of the Tyrannid species' expansion into the Milky Way galaxy. When worlds along the eastern fringe of the galaxy began to erupt in rebellion, terrorism, riots and sabotage, the same adepts claimed the people were dissatisfied with living amid an armed camp. The Inquisition's Ordo Hereticus became suspicious of the adepts' dissent and their downplaying of the situation on the eastern fringes and began an investigation which established that all of the dissenting adepts had either come from the southeastern region of the galaxy or had travelled there at some time. This was the only link between the members that could be found, and some had never even met each other. Inquisitors were also deployed from Thalassa Prime to investigate the planets of the Ultima Segmentum that were most troubled. Purges were made within the Imperium, especially on Terra, focused on suspected traitors to the Emperor within the Administratum who had had contact with the afflicted regions of the Eastern Fringe. Tens of thousands of suspected traitors were sent to prison colonies and the Astra Militarum's penal legions by the Inquisition. Yet by early year 990 of the 41st millennium, Hive fleet Kraken had already sunk its tendrils into the galaxy, isolating many Imperial worlds before any astropathic warnings could be sent. Hive fleet Behemoth had fought in a single wave that had advanced across the galaxy as a single organism. But the Kraken was actually a series of smaller, separate Tyrannid Hive fleets that moved to attack many human-settled planets simultaneously. This not only increased the difficulty for the Imperium's defenders in opposing the Hive fleet, but also increased the area of the hive mind's psychic shadow in the warp tenfold. Almost overnight, an entire Imperial sector was silenced from Terra, isolated from astropath's messages of warning by the potent power of the hive mind. Only several solar months after Hive fleet Kraken's onslaught had already begun did the first few survivors' accounts of the attacks begin to reach the wider Imperium due to the terrible turbulence in the warp. Whole planets had been wiped out by the Tyrannids in only a few hours, and the Imperium of Man once more faced an unimaginable threat. Ikar IV rebellion. But before the true threat revealed itself, the Imperium had first faced uprisings on its eastern fringe that served as the prelude to the main Tyrannid threat. One such rebellion occurred on a hive world named Ikar IV. Ikar IV was vital to the operation of the eastern fringe, as its huge manufactoria formed the centre and linchpin of one of the few densely populated Imperial sectors in the widespread Ultima Segmentum. The entire planet had been seized from the control of the Imperium by a religious fundamentalist group named the Brotherhood. Years before, the Brotherhood had captured the hearts and minds of the population of the planet by preaching the return of the Emperor in physical form and promising better times to come. This is the sort of promise that was sought by the workers of the Ikaran Manufactoria because they lived lives with no power, hope of betterment or freedom. The Brotherhood quickly set up missions and chapels throughout the poor regions of the planet. The ecclesiarchy closely monitored the Brotherhood for any signs of corruption or heresy, but none could be found. Eventually, permission was sought and granted for the construction of a Brotherhood cathedral in Lomas, the biggest city on Ikar 4. Shortly after the completion of the Brotherhood's cathedral, the trouble began. The Brotherhood refused to pay its tithes to the planetary governor and would not allow its members to be inducted into Ikar 4's planetary defense force. Brotherhood preachers whipped the Ikaran population into a frenzy, prophesying that the Emperor would return in the flesh soon. Brotherhood militias began to roam the streets, punishing anyone they deemed to be unbelievers rather than actual criminals. Events accelerated when rioting broke out during a mass demonstration outside of the Great Cathedral in Lomas. Arbitrators of the Adeptus Arbites moved in with power mauls and suppression shields to put down the rioters forcefully, but were fired upon from the cathedral by Brotherhood militia. The arbitrators returned fire and killed several of the Brotherhood's militia members. This only enraged the mob further, and they surged forward several times, eventually forcing the arbitrators to fall back, especially as another, larger mob had just arrived to support them. Rioting then spread across the planet, and most of the forces of the Arbites were forced back. When the Planetary Defense Force was called in to restore order, most members of the force rebelled and joined the ranks of the Brotherhood. Eventually, news of the assassination of the planetary governor reached the public, and vicious fighting broke out in all of the Hive cities of the planet. Within solar hours, tanks decorated with the revolutionary banners of the Brotherhood were seen driving down roads in cities, pushing the Arbites back. With the dawn, news of the assassination of the imperial governor and most of his ministers had spread over the entire planet, and the Brotherhood quickly seized control of several broadcasting stations, announcing the establishment of their new theocratic state in the name of the returning God Emperor. The Arbites still held control of the majority of the Ikaran countryside and the Arbites' precinct fortress that guarded the center of Lomas. Most of the cities had been captured by the Brotherhood, denying the Arbites vital resources. Inquisitor Agmar of the Ordo Xenos arrived 27 solar days after the rebellion began, on the same day that the Arbites' fortress in Lomas was overrun by Brotherhood forces. Most of the judges in the fortress escaped, moving to take control of the 4 main power stations of the city. Inquisitor Agmar saw this as much more of an organized rebellion than a sporadic outburst of popular religious feeling. He called for the support of the Ultramarines chapter of Astartes to help the forces of the Imperium retake the planet. While the remaining Imperial forces waited for the arrival of the Ultramarines, they bombarded the rebel cities and pushed back vicious assaults by Brotherhood militia battalions. Repeated attempts to reach the power stations of Lomas failed, and 6 days after Agmar arrived, the Arbites detonated several melter bombs, completely destroying the generators. Now the war transformed into a long, grinding campaign of urban combat, with casualties spiraling upwards daily. Every doorway could possess a booby trap, and there were Brotherhood snipers in place all over the renegade-held cities. Entire Astra Militarum patrols that remained loyal to the Imperium disappeared without trace in the chaotic maelstrom. The rebellion promised to be a long one, as the Brotherhood held the armories of the Imperial Guard regiments assigned to the planet, and had the support of the majority of the Icharan population to draw on to become soldiers in its militia. Inquisitor Agmar led several small forces of Imperial Guardsmen and arbitrators into Lomas to uncover the true nature of the Brotherhood. He was slowly piecing together the story when, in a chance raid, he slew a neophyte hybrid of the Brotherhood and saw what manner of Xenos creature was actually leading the revolt. Foul Tyrannid gin-stealers. The Brotherhood was, in fact, a gin-stealer cult. Agmar sent an astropathic message confirming his fears of another Tyrannid invasion to the Inquisition and awaited the arrival of the Ultramarines. Gin-stealer infestation. 39 solar days after the Ikaran rebellion began, the Ultramarines battle barge Octavius entered orbit above Ikar 4 and deployed its drop pods. The planetary defences were largely inactive due to the damage to the power generators of Lomas, and as such, the Space Marines' landing casualties were light. The Space Marines secured the Astra Militarum's armories and the Imperial Governor's Palace, and fought off several poorly organised counterattacks, causing massive casualties among the Brotherhood's forces. Outside, the remaining Imperial Guard forces launched coordinated attacks to link up with the Ultramarines, using their Lehman Russ main battle tanks as moving strongpoints, and slowly, inevitably, the Brotherhood's lines bent back. More than 20 veteran Marines in Terminator armour from the Ultramarines' elite First Company teleported into the Great Brotherhood Cathedral in Lomas and destroyed the cathedral's defenders after Agmar sent a message to the Octavius via spy satellite. More guards appeared from side doors, and a storm of las-beams and autoshells ripped out, massacring many of the Brotherhood guards, but not before several of the Terminators were dragged down. The Terminator's single heavy flamer proved to be invaluable, its flames incinerating the unprotected assaulting forces. Yet some of the Brotherhood neophytes were striking out with inhuman speed and terrible claws, indicating their Xenos heritage. The Terminators then spread out and searched for the myriad of secret passages that they presumed existed beneath the Brotherhood Cathedral. They soon found one under the altar, and the altar was quickly removed. As they moved down into the crypt, they heard the clattering of claws on stone. As the creatures jumped into the lights of the Ultramarines, they were identified as Djinn Stealers. This showed the Inquisitor's belief that there was a Djinn Stealer cult at the heart of the Brotherhood's revolution to be correct. The battle began and raged for a long time. Hundreds of Djinn Stealers died, piling up one on top of each other. Eventually, the Horde's numbers were spent in their attack. Several Ultramarine Terminators had been killed as their armour was torn open by the inhumanly sharp claws of the Djinn Stealers. The remainder of the Astartes moved further into the crypt without encountering more of the creatures. Deep beneath the city of Lomas, they found a huge cavern where the huge and bloated great-grandfather of the brood, the powerful Djinn Stealer Patriarch, sat. As the Terminators approached, another horde of Djinn Stealers intent on protecting their alien master attacked the Terminators from out of nowhere. Storm bolters rang out, resulting in pure carnage. The company librarian fought his way to the dais, but the Patriarch used its psychic powers to attack the Space Marine Psyker. A surge from the Astartes' psychic hood broke the spell, and the librarian forced his body out of the real world for an instant, and then he reappeared, teleported onto the dais. The creature lashed out, and blood and sparks flew from the librarian, but the Patriarch easily parried the return blow. The librarian called on his battle brothers for assistance, and the dais was swept with bolter fire. Some shells pierced the power armor of the librarian, but the Patriarch was also wounded. The librarian used this opportunity to strike with his force axe, the librarian's own psychic power behind the blow, allowing the weapon to tear through the tough hide of the Patriarch. The Patriarch was dead, suddenly leaving the brood and the entire revolution leaderless and unconnected by the cult's broodmind. The revolution felt the death of its leader and lost its impetus and cohesion. The remaining Terminators slew the rest of the Djinn Stealers, and the battles above slowly stopped, as the revolutionaries could only retrench themselves and no longer act in a fully coordinated manner without the Patriarch's subtle psychic guidance over the cult. Small groups of Brotherhood acolyte hybrids and neophyte hybrids held their positions in bunkers and towers, but were soon destroyed by the tanks and heavy fighting vehicles of the Astra Militarum. Ikar 4 was back under the control of the Imperium, and all remnants of the Djinn Stealer cult, the Djinn Stealers, their hybrids, infected humans, cult members and traitors, were ruthlessly wiped out. Inquisitor Agmar, leading the Ultramarines, methodically purged the planet, which eventually returned to normal. There were still questions that remained unanswered. One was the fate of the human leader of the Brotherhood, as his body was never found. The second was that the planet's astropaths had reported a shift in the warp, distant still, but the oldest of the astropaths had sensed the psychic call of the Djinn Stealer Patriarch radiating out into space and felt the change in the warp. He had sensed something vast and shadowy, a monstrous entity which had turned its attention towards Ikar 4. Hive Fleet Kraken. The Kraken comes. The horror stories that attended Hive Fleet Krakens coming to Imperial space were numerous. Among the many tragedies of this time were the following. In the Miral system, Astra Militarum regiments and the Space Marines of the Scythes of the Emperor chapter held out against the Tyrannids of Hive Fleet Kraken, who had overrun the lush jungles and plantations of Miral Prime. The Imperial forces retreated to a huge mesa called the Giant's Coffin, where they defended against the vicious hordes of Xenos that infested the dense jungles below. The flora of Miral itself had become mutated since the first mycetic spores of Hive Fleet Kraken had fallen on the world, and eventually only constant defoliation with flamers prevented the Tyrannid spore-infected creepers from engulfing the Giant's Coffin. A rogue trader brought rumours of the feral world of Larnano to the Imperium's heart, a planet that had come to be ruled by the celebrants of nihilism, a heretical doomsday cult whose adherents had taken care to match their prophecies with the dire events of the times. When elements of Hive Fleet Kraken arrived at Larnano, nearly 75% of the planet's population had calmly marched towards the Tyrannid bioships to be consumed by their new gods. The rogue trader also brought a tale from the giant asteroid monastery of Salem, which told how the ecclesiarchy monks there had chosen to poison both themselves and their carefully terraformed ecosystem rather than allow all to be consumed by the great devourer. Another dedicated Imperial merchant captain helped evacuate millions of Imperial citizens from the mining worlds of the Devlin system before it was consumed. Devlin's extensive system of Novastorm space stations held the Hive fleet at bay long enough for a fleet of giant ore freighters to escape into the warp. A company of Space Marines of the Lamenters chapter held off the attacks of the Tyrannid warriors until the last starship had been loaded, though the Space Marines in the end sacrificed their own lives so that many more might live. Even those who fled successfully found little respite from the horror. One of the giant ore freighters fleeing Devlin arrived at the world of Adar's Hope ominously dark and silent. Those investigating the ship's automated landing discovered that within lay a blood-drenched abattoir where thousands of refugees had been mercilessly butchered by a Tyrannid organism that had breached the starship's quarantine even as it fled. Only 3 solar weeks later, Adar's Hope itself was a blood-soaked ruin of a world. The Great Devourer had claimed even more victims. Seen on a galactic scale, Hive Fleet Kraken was attacking across a front that covered thousands of light-years. Some worlds were bypassed, isolated by the Hive Fleet's shadow in the warp, or attacked unexpectedly, making a cohesive Imperial defense almost impossible to mount. The Imperium was forced to concentrate its forces on the most strategically important Forge worlds and Hive worlds, while it evacuated or simply abandoned to their horrific fate many others. Still, there were some bright moments for the Imperium. Several Space Marine chapters dedicated their forces to saving worlds the wider armies of the Astra Militarum had abandoned. Some, such as the Lamenters and the Scythes of the Emperor, found their once proud chapters reduced to a few scattered remains as the price of their valour, while the Knights of Eternity chapter is presumed to have been completely obliterated. Others carried the battle to the Tyrannids as only the Space Marines can, striking at isolated tendrils of the Kraken, boarding Hive ships and blowing them apart from the inside. Yet, no matter the efforts of the Imperium, the Tyrannids were too numerous and drove ever deeper into the galaxy, towards the heart of the Imperium of Man. Battle of Ikar 4. Fortunately for humanity, Hive Fleet Kraken did not remain divided into separate tendrils indefinitely and eventually began to coalesce into a single massive swarm on Ikar 4, the Hive world, whose large Djinn-stealer cult infestation had been the initial harbinger of the Kraken's arrival in the Milky Way galaxy. As the Tyrannids approached the planet, thousands of Djinn-stealers and the hybrid offspring of the Brotherhood suddenly burst from the underhives in support of the invading Xenos, giving the lie to claims that the alien infestation had been entirely purged years earlier. Defense perimeters were completely overrun, Astra Militarum forces slain by the thousands. In the terrible confusion, an ever larger number of Tyrannid organisms made planetfall. Not only the termagants and gargoyles that had composed the vanguard of the prior assaults, but the truly monstrous carnifexes and tyrannofexes as well. Worse still, gigantic hierodule and hierophant biotitans stalked across the surface of the beleaguered world. The Tyrannids had unleashed on Ichar 4 every terrible organic weapon in their arsenal. Despite all this, Ichar 4 was not yet lost to humanity. Forewarned of Tyrannid interest in the world by the previous Ginstealer cult infestation, the Imperium was able to mount a more solid defense in the Ichar system than in the other areas of the eastern fringes under assault by Hive fleet Kraken. Chapter Master Marneus Calgar, the Lord of Ultramar and hero of the First Tyrannic War, led the Ultramarines into battle against their old foe on Ichar 4, just as he had against Hive fleet Behemoth on Macragge 200 Terran years earlier. The Ultramarines inflicted crushing losses on the Tyrannid armada in space above the planet and in the claustrophobic corridors of the towering Icaran Hive cities. Space Marine Tyrannic War veterans of the First Tyrannic War made planetfall and scoured Ichar 4's hives in a series of close-quarter battles that lasted for close to a full Terran year. By employing the same tactics that had proved successful in defeating Hive fleet Behemoth in Ultramar 2 centuries earlier, Marneus Calgar rallied the Imperial defenders of Ichar 4 and cast the Tyrannids from that planet forevermore. But as always, victory against the Tyrannids had come at a terrible price. Ichar 4 was reduced to a smoking charnel house of death and destruction, a world and its people sacrificed so that the Imperium of Man might endure yet another storm, Battle of Radnar. The Justus regiments are regiments of the Astra Militarum raised on the civilized world of Justus. Collectively known as the Emperor's Shield, these regiments are known to be highly decorated. Following fighting against the Tyrannids from Hive fleet Kraken on Ichar 4, Imperial forces, including a Justus regiment, were redeployed to the nearby Hive world of Radnar. The area around Jermal Hive was filled with Tyrannid nests. Imperial forces surrounded Jermal Hive and a 6-solar-week bombardment was commenced. The Emperor's Shield Regiment massed its armoured company, which included hellhounds and flamer-equipped Lehman Russ demolishers. The tanks, in close formation, destroyed the nests and killed any Tyrannids that emerged, eventually shattering their link to the Hive mind. The remaining Tyrannids were herded to the far side of the Hive site and easily destroyed. Assault on Iyanden. The first warning the craftworld Eldari of Iyanden had of the danger posed by the Tyrannids of Hive fleet Kraken was brought in the year 992 of the 41st millennium by the craftworld's far-roaming rangers. Those Asuriani whose instincts drive them to a life of exploration and danger, and who secretly monitored the planets and alien races near their craftworld. The news that the Rangers brought was terrible indeed. A Tyrannid Hive fleet of immense proportions was heading towards Iyanden craftworld. Already over a dozen Imperial planets had been consumed by the Tyrannids' advance, and although the human Imperium was mounting furious counterattacks where possible, it would be months until a major Imperial task force could be fully mobilized to deal with the threat. By the time the Imperial frontier was stabilized, the Asuriani of Iyanden knew that their precious craft world would have been overrun. Farseer Kelmon, political leader and spiritual head of the craft world, called together the Asuriani of Iyanden and warned them of the impending Tyrannid assault. Each Eldari craft world has a great hall known as the Place of Answering, which is capable of holding every member of the craft world's population. At times of emergency, the craft world Eldari met there so that all may know of the peril that faced their craft world, and so that any Asuriani might voice an opinion on the course of action that should be taken. Only once all views had been debated and a consensus reached, would the craft world's Farseer decide on the course of action to be taken. The debate by the people of Iyanden on the action to take against Hive fleet Kraken's approach was heated and prolonged. The more conservative elements of the craft world argued for a policy of isolation, shielding the craft world behind a powerful psychic shield in an attempt to avoid all contact with the Tyrannids. The more aggressive elements wanted to attack the Tyrannids immediately, dispatching the fleet to destroy the Tyrannids before they reached the craft world. Both courses of action were problematic, however, because they took no account of the sheer size of the Tyrannid Hive fleet. It took a powerful speech from the ranger Irilith, who had seen the Hive fleet at first hand and understood the terrible threat that it represented, to sway the assembled Asuryani. For over a solar hour she drove home to all present that it would take the combined efforts of every Eldari on Iyanden to have any chance of turning back the Tyrannids. Even then, they might not succeed in defeating the alien menace. A hush fell on the hall as Irilith finished her speech. No more needed to be said, for all the Asuryani present now realized the sheer enormity of the task ahead. Farseer Kelman rose and ordered that the Eldari prepare the defences of Craftworld Iyanden. All elements of the fleet would be recalled, and every single Eldari must take on the warrior aspect of Warlock, Guardian or Aspect Warrior for the first time in Eldari history since the fall. The entire Craftworld would be fortified, for there could be no doubt that the Tyrannids would breach their outer defences and land on the immense worldship. Help must be requested from the other Asuryani craftworlds. The Avatar, the embodied spirit of the craftworld's war god, Kaela Menshakain, must be awakened to take part in the battle. And, most terrible of all of the craftworld's ancient spirit stones must be plucked from their resting places and implanted in cybernetic exoskeletons to battle as ghost warriors. As many Imperial scholars know, when an Eldari of the Asuryani kindred dies, their spirit is released into a gem known as a spirit stone, which is grafted into the very structure of their craft world to preserve the dead Eldari's consciousness and prevent it from migrating into the warp, where it will be devoured by the chaos god Slanesh. Thus, each craft world is actually a living, intelligent being which preserves a little of the once great Eldari civilization. By risking the destruction of the craft world's spirit stones, Kelmon risked the destruction of Lianden's culture, racial memory, and literally the souls of its people. It was a grave chance to take, but Kelmon knew that the Ghost Warriors could make the difference between victory and defeat in the struggle that was coming. The first Tyrannid Hive swarms attacked Iyanden just 20 solar days later. By then, the craft world had already been isolated for over a solar week by the hive mind's shadow in the warp, which made it extremely difficult for the other Asuryani craft worlds to send help through the webway or psychically communicate with their brethren. Apart from a few scattered units that made it through, Iyanden ultimately fought the Tyrannids on its own. Nonetheless, the first Tyrannid waves were dealt with easily and efficiently by the Eldari fleet. The Eldari's spacecraft were faster, more maneuverable, and had longer-ranged weapons than their opponents. In battle after battle, the Eldari spacecraft destroyed the lumbering biomechanical Tyrannid Hive ships, while only suffering minimal casualties themselves. For a while it looked as if the Eldari fleet might be able to hold off the Tyrannids on its own, as wave after wave of Tyrannids were wiped out. But Farseer Kelman was not convinced. Already, the ability of the craftworld's Wraithbone forges to replace destroyed Eldari spacecraft was being far outstripped by the casualties being suffered in the deep space battles that raged around the craftworld. The Eldari fleet was being ground down in a massive battle of attrition, a battle that only the Tyrannids, with their vastly superior numbers, could hope to win. As if to confirm Kelman's worst fears, the next Tyrannid wave attack was massive, very nearly twice the size of any that had hit the craft world so far. The Eldari fleet suffered terrible casualties in its attempt to hold the Tyrannids off, and for the first time was unable to stop them from landing on the craft world itself. Although the landing was wiped out before any serious damage was done to Iyanden's defences, the Eldari fleet, as a large-scale fighting force, had ceased to exist. Still, there was hope, especially if the wave had represented the Tyrannid Hive fleet's main assault force. The Eldari's morale was raised even more, as the next Tyrannid wave turned out to be tiny in comparison to what had come earlier. Although the weakened Eldari fleet couldn't keep all of the swarms away from the craft world, the landings that were made were easily isolated and destroyed. For a short while, It seemed that the Eldari had weathered the terrible storm of Hive Fleet Kraken. Then Iyanden was hit by two huge Tyrannid attacks in rapid succession. The pitiful remnants of the Eldari fleet opposed the Hive swarms as best they could, but were ultimately swept aside by a tide of living alien spacecraft. Iyanden was all but engulfed as horde after horde of Tyrannid warriors, Jinn Stealers, Gaunts and Carnifexes were disgorged onto the craft world's surface and interior. Huge battles erupted all over Iyanden, the fighting bitter and close-ranged with enemy forces often only separated by the width of a corridor of wraithbone wall. As the Eldari desperately attempted to beat off the alien invaders, often they succeeded, but the Fortress of Tears, the Shrine of Asurion, and, most terrible of all, the ancient Forests of Silence, repositories of the flora and fauna of the lost Eldari Empire's homeworlds on Iyanden, all fell to the Tyrannid hordes. The Eldari furiously counterattacked, the raging figure of the Avatar of Cain leading the Craftworld's Aspect Warriors, Guardians and Wraithguard and Wraithlord Ghost Warriors in a berserk orgy of destruction which recaptured the Forests of Silence from the Tyrannids. It is said that the Eldari warriors wept tears of rage and sorrow to see the damage inflicted on the ancient forest domes of their craft world. Slowly the Eldari managed to turn the tide on the Tyrannids and gain the upper hand, forcing them back onto the defensive. And then another huge Tyrannid wave arrived, the third in succession and the largest yet. As swarm after swarm flickered into existence on the Eldari's scanners, Kelman knew that, barring a miracle, Iyanden Craftworld was doomed. Over 50 Terran years before the Tyrannid assault, High Admiral Iriel, an autarch, had led the Iyanden fleet. Although he was considered one of the greatest Eldari naval tacticians to have ever lived, his character was flawed by the sin of pride. When Iyanden had been threatened by a Chaos space fleet raiding out of the Eye of Terror, Iriel had led the Eldari fleet on a preemptive attack on the Chaos fleet's flagship, leaving the Iyanden Craftworld unprotected. He only returned just in time to stop a self-destructive strike by a small flotilla of Chaos raider ships, who nonetheless managed to damage the Craftworld. Expecting to be feted and honoured for his victory, Iriel was deeply angered when he was called upon to defend his course of action. Claiming that his record should speak for itself, Iriel refused to enter into the debate, leaving his old friend Farseer Kelman no choice but to elect a new High Admiral in his place. Bitter with rage, Iriel had vowed that he would never set foot on Iyanden again. He and a small band of followers left the Craftworld to pursue the path of the outcast and formed an Eldari corsair company known as the Eldritch Raiders that became the single most powerful Eldari pirate force operating in the galaxy. Yet when he heard of Hive Fleet Kraken's assault on Iyanden, Prince Iriel did his best to ignore the terrible peril that threatened his old Craftworld. But proud though he was, righteously angry though he remained, Iriel could not leave Lianden's people to their fate in this, their darkest hour. Battling his way through the Tyrannid's psychic blockade, Iriel swept to the aid of his people and arrived just in time. Like a thunderbolt from the blue Iriel, and his large Eldari raider fleet smashed into the swarm of Tyrannid vessels. He was quickly joined by the few remaining craft of Iyanden's fleet, and together the combined Eldari space fleets tore the swarms of Hive Fleet Kraken apart. Two more waves of Tyrannid hive swarms from the Kraken attacked the Craftworld, only to meet the same fate. Not a single Tyrannid bioship reached the Craftworld, though the cost to Iriel's Eldritch Raiders was dear. Blooded but unbowed, the raiders prepared to sell their lives to the last in order to turn back the next wave of Tyrannids. On the bridges of the Craftworld and of the circling Eldari starships, vigilant eyes watched the scanners, waiting for the first telltale blip that would indicate the direction of the next assault. Minutes passed, then hours, and with a growing sense of wonder, the Eldari realized that no more Tyrannid swarms were coming. The assault was over. Hive Fleet Kraken had been dispersed, its coherence had been destroyed. But on Iyanden Craftworld the war raged on. The Tyrannid hordes that had been fighting a tenacious rearguard action awaiting the aid of the rest of the Hive Fleet now turned like cornered rats and hurled themselves at the Eldari. Caught by surprise, the Asuriani staggered back, desperately trying to hold in the face of the desperate Tyrannid onslaught. The fortress of the Red Moon fell to a surprise attack, and for a moment it seemed that with victory within their grasp, the Eldari would yet be defeated. But for the second time, Iriel led his eldritch raiders to the rescue of the craft world. Disembarking from their orbiting spacecraft, the raiders joined with the battered defenders of Iyanden Craftworld and meter by meter, step by step, forced the Tyranids back. A final wild charge, led by the Tyrannid Hive tyrant, was annihilated by the combined efforts of the Avatar of Cain, Prince Iriel, and the Ghost Warriors. And then, in a series of vicious one-sided battles, the last of the Tyranids were hunted down and destroyed. The Tyrannid attack on Iyanden Craftworld was over. The Tyranids had been defeated, but the victory was a hollow one. Though the Craftworld Eldari had repulsed the invaders, the cost was enormous. Their once proud Craftworld stood in ruins, and 4/5 of the inhabitants were dead or lay dying in its shattered halls. Amongst their number lay Farsia Kelman, surrounded by the bodies of a dozen Tyrannid zoanthropes whose wretched heads bore the marks of psychic fire. Iyanden's mighty space fleet was a pitiful shadow of its former self. The blasted remains of its majestic spacecraft and their brave crews hanging silent and weightless in space. But all this could be rebuilt, maybe not for hundreds of Eldari generations, but one day in the distant future. What was lost forever were the souls of the Asuriani, whose spirit stones had been destroyed in the battle against the Tyranids. The massive destruction wrought upon the people and the ghost warriors of Iyanden dealt that craft world and the entire Eldari species a blow from which its culture could never fully recover. Defeat of the Kraken. Hive fleet. Kraken was little more than splintered fragments of its former might, yet credit could not lie entirely with the Asuriani defenders of craftworld Iyanden, nor the actions of the Ultramarines on Ikar 4. The craftworld Eldari and the Imperium had fought as unwitting allies. Had the Kraken not struck Iyanden, the Ultramarines' victory at Ikar 4 would have been impossible, and vice versa. Had either Ikar 4 or Iyanden fallen, the Kraken would have proven unstoppable. The scattered remnants of the Tyrannid attack on Ikar 4 fled towards the galactic core, driving within the Imperial defense perimeters that had been erected against Hive Fleet Kraken. These splinter fleets became an even greater threat to the Imperium as they fed upon unsuspecting and poorly defended worlds far from the main Tyrannic war zones in the eastern fringes of the galaxy. Running battles with these Kraken splinter fleets continued for many years after the Hive Fleet's passage, draining Imperial defences against later Tyrannid incursions. It is doubtful if the true extent of the devastation wrought by the Kraken will ever be known to the adepts of the Administratum. The splinter fleets are comprised by as few as a dozen hive ships, but even a dozen of these living vessels are more than capable of overrunning a human world and harvesting its biomass so that it may become an even greater threat. Some Kraken splinter fleets have become so large through this method as to be classified by the Imperium as a new, distinct hive fleet of its own. Indeed, Hive Fleet Megalodon grew from one of the splinters of the Kraken and continues to ravage portions of the Imperium in the present. With no doubt, the Tyranids as a whole have learned much about the Imperium's inner defences from the actions of these splinter fleets. Every battle the Tyranids engage in, regardless of the outcome, adds to the hive mind's growing understanding of its new prey's behaviour and tactics. It may perhaps have been the true reason for Hive Fleet Kraken's existence, to test Imperial defences for the far larger Tyrannid invasion of the Milky Way galaxy that is to come. If such strategic brilliance is a hallmark of the hive mind, then humanity, indeed all the intelligent races of the galaxy, have much to fear in the coming days. The Imperium barely had time to breathe following the end of the Second Tyrannic War, before it learned that both Hive Fleets Behemoth and Kraken had been little more than reconnaissance forces for the true threat to the very existence of humanity. The arrival of Hive Fleet Leviathan in the year 997 of the 41st millennium, Damocles Gulf Campaign. In the year 991 of the 41st millennium, an outer wing of Hive Fleet Kraken approached the Damocles Gulf and destroyed a Ta'au exploration vessel in a region the Xenos termed the Corward Marches. The vessel managed to deploy a courier drone before self-destructing, which made it to the Tau Empire, and alerted it to the threat approximately 18 solar months later. In response, the Tau aborted a nearly successful invasion of the strategically important imperial planet Quadrividia, offering an alliance against the oncoming Tyrannids to the local imperial forces under the command of Lord General Xivan. The Imperium accepted the truce and provided astropaths to serve aboard Tau vessels to coordinate the wider defense of the Damocles Gulf region. While the Tau moved to reinforce the border planet Dr. Thanier, close to the main Hive fleet's course, an Imperial task force comprising approximately 100 warships under Admiral Boom and several Astra Militarum regiments under Xivan, including at least one from the Death Corps of Krieg, gathered at the strategic forge world Fecundia located further off the Tyrannids' course, joining local Skitarii and a small garrison of Adeptus Astartes from the Reclaimers chapter. The rest of Battlefleet Damocles was to intercept the bulk of the fleet at Quadrividia. After defeating the first wave of Tyrannids, the forces at Fecundia realized that the Hive Mind wished to destroy a fragment of a Hive ship from a rival brood that had been recovered by the Adeptus Mechanicus from Nusquam Fundamentibus around the year 941 of the 41st millennium. In the process, they learned that Magos Kildhar, a senior Mechanicus official, had been implanted by a Djinn stealer aboard the Space Hulk Spawn of Damnation at some point after the year 929 of the 41st millennium and now served its broodmind. Commissar Cafus Kane was forced to shoot her dead with his last pistol. While the planetary government began genetic screenings for additional Djinn stealer implantees, Fecundia came under a renewed attack by the Hive fleet, still targeting the bioship fragment that lay under the Mechanicus headquarters. Outnumbered and outgunned, the Imperials were forced to release a cache of frozen Tyrannid bioforms recovered with the bioship fragment as a diversion. Realizing from their behavior that the two competing Hive minds were partially neutralizing each other, the Imperials hit on using a psyker to amplify the bioship's signal. Astropath Clementine Dre gave her life for the operation, which destabilized the Hive fleet's command and control and gave the upper hand to the Navis Imperialis, which destroyed multiple escort bioships and a Hive ship at the heart of the fleet, forcing the Xenos into full retreat. In the wake of the invasion, the Astra Militarum established a permanent garrison on Fecundia to supplement the native Skitarii, and by the year 58 of the 42nd millennium in the era Indomitus, with no confirmed Tyrannid sightings for 3 solar decades, the planet had been officially declared cleansed. Despite the key Imperial victory at Fecundia, war between Hive Fleet Kraken and the Imperial Tau Alliance continued to rage in the eastern fringe for some time to come. The border world of Semplaxia, which had changed hands between humans and Xenos 7 times in the past 2 standard centuries, fell early, and at least 2 other Forge worlds and several Imperial Hive worlds supplying the regional Astra Militarum and Adeptus Astartes were lost to the Great Devourer. This in turn drove the Adeptus Mechanicus to accelerate the process of bringing new Forge worlds such as Eucopia to full war production status. The battle against Hive Fleet Kraken was brutal and devastating, yet the Tyrannid fleet still poses a deadly threat. What does the future hold for the Imperium?